Welcome to Lecture 1415. Dr. JC here. 3 weeks left. The old military saw applies definitely now. Stay alert, stay alive. Now, before we get into World War II, both in Europe and the Pacific, and we're going to look at this chronologically as well rather than thematically. And I'll apologize because things are going to be a little bit choppy and hackneyed. We're going to be jumping back and forth between the Pacific and European theaters and what's going on in America. And thus, in a way, I'll apologize for the orange barrels. Not that you can see them, but this is going to be entirely under construction. This being all of World War II segment, entirely under construction coming this summer. So I'm going to revamp both these lectures. With that caveat aside, let's pick up with where we left off. And where we left off in Lecture 13 was with Hitler inking that deal with the Russians, that German-Soviet non-aggression pact, to which both of them were eyeing Poland. And I mentioned that almost immediately upon that ink drying from that deal, Hitler launches his invasion of Poland. Prior to getting into the invasion itself, the map here at the center might tell a little bit of a tale. Germans are divided, and in the wake of World War I, Poland was reconstituted as a nation. It became the Second Polish Republic, and they were given access to the Baltic Sea, which split Germans, Eastern Prussians, from the rest of Germany. Hitler obviously had a problem with that, so part of the pretense of the invasion here is to unify all German-speaking peoples, and if that's at the expense of the Polish, so be it. And on September 1st, 1939, lightning war, a blitzkrieg hits western Poland. The Germans invade and begin to overrun large chunks of real estate. German armor supported by close air support, cutting holes in the Polish defensive lines and leading to this breakthrough. Now, while things are going well for Hitler, he starts to get a little bit nervous because he fully expected that the Soviets would attack from the east. That hadn't happened. Part of the reason that didn't happen is because the Soviets were hammering out a peace accord with the Japanese. There was a 5-month-long undeclared war that had been going on with Japan between the Russians and the Japanese. And naturally, and I think wisely, Stalin said, look, we need to make sure we have this peace treaty in place with the Japanese before we go ahead and invade to the west, largely because we don't want to face a two-front war. A peace treaty will be hammered out with the Japanese, and on September 17th, 1939, Russian forces begin to slice through eastern Poland. And by October 8th, Russians and Germans basically meet in the middle, and Poland will be divided accordingly. So you may question, what is France and Great Britain and other nations doing at this point? Are they just sitting by watching Poland being devoured here? The answer to that is no. In fact, part of the reason Hitler was so concerned about a lack of Soviet movement was because on September 3rd, 2 days after he invaded Poland from the west, Britain and France declared war on Germany. So you can almost imagine Hitler's angst here for several days before that the Russians do begin to move from the east, thinking, wow, did they cut a deal with the British and the French, and now here I'm caught in the middle? And while that didn't turn out to be the case, Germany is facing war against other European powers. And as a result, they turn their eyes north first and then west. Interestingly enough, between October of 1939, when Poland falls, and all the way to the spring in 1940, not much happens. So historians refer to this blitzkrieg from Poland to a sitzkrieg, and thus not much happening until April 9th, 1940, when Denmark and Norway are going to be overrun by German forces. And it's going to blow up Britain's Plan R4, as it was called. It was the defense of Norway and Sweden against German forces and German aggression, and it's an abject failure. And as a result of that, as a result of the Germans overrunning Denmark and Norway, Neville Chamberlain's government's going to fall in England, and some guy named Winston Churchill is going to be the new prime minister. And on Churchill's first day on the job as prime minister, on May 10th, just as he's getting ready to take over at 10 Downing Street, German forces begin to overrun the Low Countries, and the Battle of France is on. The Battle of France, also remembered now as the Fall of France, is going to take place over roughly about 6 weeks, from May 10th through the 25th of June. So just as fast as Bismarck was able to beat the Austrians in that Austro-Prussian War, part of those wars of German unification. Hitler's going to defeat the French in roughly 6 weeks here, too. Interesting sidebar for everybody. On the 10th of June, some country called Italy decided to enter the war as well. They will side with the Germans, of course, and they will too invade France via the Alps. So that's going to help lead to the fall of France. But the Italians, holding true to their colors, waiting to see who might be the winning side here before they jump into the game. The Italians choose the Germans, perhaps prematurely. But with the fall of France, land operations in places like France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, what would have been formerly the Western Front in World War I, land operations there are going to end until the Allies will invade in June 6th of 1944. So almost 4 years, this will be German-occupied land. With the French effectively out of the war in June of 1940, that leaves Great Britain alone to face Germany. And while Hitler did kick around the idea of possibly invading the British Isles, he says, you know what, we're going to go ahead and attack you from under the sea and from the clouds instead. We're going to send our submarines to patrol your waters, sink any ships coming in and out of Great Britain, and we're going to also unleash our Luftwaffe, our Air Force, and bomb the ever-living piss out of you. We will starve you into submission. That's how we're going to deal with the British. And thus what begins is this Battle of the Atlantic and the Battle of Britain. Regarding the prior, the Battle of the Atlantic, I would just briefly mention here that the German submarine commander Karl Dönitz had come up with this new concept. It was an adaptation of what they started at the end of World War I, known as the use of wolf packs. This is where a series of German subs are going to operate together to attack a convoy. So just as a pack of wolves can turn one apex predator into one super apex predator, German submarines would operate in the same capacity. And they're not interested in sinking just one vessel in a convoy. They're interested in sinking the entire convoy. For those interested, I'd ask that you check it out, to include the German engineering as it relates to submarines. Out of this world, especially later in the war. And as shown on the map here, German submarines are going to operate all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. In fact, if you travel to the Outer Banks of North Carolina today on Ocracoke Island, there are still some folks that are alive today that can tell you stories of seeing ships being torpedoed right off the coast, right outside the Diamond Shoals there. Thus, before more advanced systems of sonar and radar are put into place, German submarines had a crippling effect on supplies being sent into the British Isles. They did. And American supplies, hell, any supplies getting into Britain were absolutely essential for the British. After all, they stood alone. And just as Hitler's undersea approach, the use of submarines, begins to take its toll on trade into the British Isles, he also launches what's remembered in England as the Blitz. The Blitz is part of this larger Battle of Britain. It takes place specifically between September 1940 and May of 1941. And it entails Germany's use of its Luftwaffe Air Force, especially its bomber corps, to go after major industrial cities and targets, to include civilian populations if need be. Hitler's less concerned about collateral damage, civilian damage, and more concerned about getting the Brits to tap out. Yet unfortunately for Hitler, he's not dealing with Neville Chamberlain anymore. He's dealing with a pit bull by the name of Winston Churchill. And Churchill will do everything in his power to rally the British civilian spirit behind the cause. Perhaps best encapsulated in his June 4th, 1940 speech to the House of Commons, the one where he concludes the speech by saying that we shall fight on to the end, we shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender, says he, at the same time making an open appeal to the United States to do something, to do more, to get in the game. Miraculously, the British will hold on, and the United States will begin to get involved. Starting in January of 1941, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration, FDR's administration, looked for ways to go ahead and try to provide supplies and the means to wage war to the Allies. Allies. The Allies being everyone except Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, naturally, if you were one of the Axis nations, Germany, Italy, or Japan, this is kind of a WTF, right? You're supposed to be neutral, America. You've passed neutrality acts, but yet you're going to supply goods to our enemies, and we're supposed to not see that as a threat from you somehow? How's that work? This Lend-Lease program was doubly troublesome for the Japanese because in the previous September, in September of 1940, the U.S. Congress passed the Export Control Act, basically cut off Japan's ability to contract with U.S. firms for goods they needed to wage war. Japan was reliant on the United States for items such as oil, aircraft fuel, aircraft parts, scrap steel, iron, all the stuff necessary to wage war, and the U.S. then cuts that off in September of 1940, at the same time supplying the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek with arms and equipment. I'm not trying to intimate that the United States is picking a fight here with Japan, but maybe they're picking a fight here with Japan. The Lend-Lease program is going to be expanded in June of 1941 when Hitler decides to go ahead and launch the largest ever invasion in European history. 3.5 million Germans strong, sent east against Stalin in Russia. If he can't defeat the Brits, he's going to get out in front of this. He's not fighting a two-front war again. I'll take out the Russians, and then we'll go back for the British if we have to. And as a result of German success, and much of it early on, by the late summer, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decides to meet Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. They meet in August of 1941 and hammer out a series of points, 8 in total, that are going to shape a more peaceful post-war world. Now, these quote-unquote common principles were shared with the world. This wasn't a secret meeting. But I want everyone to think the timing of this. This is August of 1941. And for some of you, you might be saying, well, so what? Well, for others of you that recognize that Japan does not attack Pearl Harbor until December of 1941, everyone can now look and say, wow, okay, so the U.S. is lining themselves with Britain, acting as if they're allies, talking about how we're going to shape the world as if we've already won the war, and the United States isn't even in it yet. So if you're the Japanese, how's American neutrality looking to you right now? Lest I sound too sympathetic to Japan, understand I'm not. Just because this statement was issued in August did not mean that Japan had any right to go ahead and attack the United States. But what it did do was reinforce decisions the Japanese had already made. Hideki Tojo and the War Ministry met in the summer of 1941, and the majority voted to attack the United States, not Russia. There was a good bit of talk about opening a second front with the Germans on the Russia to make Russians fight a two-front war. That was overruled, and it was determined that the United States posed the bigger threat, and therefore planning for this surprise attack had actually started in the summer of 41, even before this Atlantic Charter was released. And for those that may not know, the Japanese did launch a surprise attack in the morning of December 7th, 1941. As a result of that, President of the United States will ask for a war resolution. He will get it. President Roosevelt will refer to this as a day that will live in infamy for America and American history. The United States will declare war on Japan as well as Germany and Italy. The United States is officially at war. Rather than getting into detail about any more specific battles, whether they be important ones in the Pacific theater, such as the Battle of Coral Sea and Midway, in European theater, especially in the Mediterranean, North Africa against Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the invasion of Sicily, which is the jumping off point to the actual invasion of the Italian peninsula and demise of Mussolini, or the all-important Allied invasion of France in June of 1944, Operation Overlord or D-Day. Rather, I would ask that you Google any or all of them for greater detail, because the focus here was really more on the road to World War II and how the United States wound up getting into the game, so to speak. And thus, as we transition out of Part 1 here to Part 2, we'll pick up in Part 2 with the Allies successfully invading the continent in 1944, beginning this drive to Berlin to end the war in Europe. We'll focus more on the war in the Pacific and two key events as well. The Allies' discovery and realization of this final solution as it relates to the Nazi Party and Jews, Gypsies, and others. and the U.S. decision to make use of atomic weaponry as a way to end the war in the Pacific. Dr. JC out here, part 1, lectures 14 and 15. This has covered the content for week 14. We'll turn next in part 2 to the content in week 15.